My daughter sat on a cold porch for 4 hours while my mother watched a movie inside with the volume up. When I finally got there, soaked to the bone, shaking, my mother opened the door and said one sentence that I will remember until the day I stop breathing. "We voted. This isn't your home anymore." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I looked at her and said, "Okay." That single word confused her more than any argument could have. She expected a fight. What she got instead was stillness, because I already knew something she didn't. 4 days later, a man in a gray suit knocked on her door holding a folder that would end everything she thought she owned. "My name is Whitney, and this is the night my family found out that composed women are not the same as weak women. Rain doesn't fall gently in October. It comes down sideways, angry, soaking through everything it touches. That's the kind of rain that was falling when I pulled into the driveway of the house I grew up in and saw my 11-year-old daughter, Josephine, curled up on the top step with her backpack pulled over her knees like a shield. She wasn't crying when I got out of the car. She had already run out of tears by the time I arrived. Her lips were a pale shade of blue, and her sneakers had gone from white to gray from sitting in a puddle that had crept across the porch. "Mom," she said, and her voice cracked on that single word. "The key doesn't work. I tried calling you so many times, but my phone died an hour ago." I pulled my own phone out of my coat pocket and felt my stomach drop. My shift had run long, and I'd left my phone locked in my locker at the hospital for the last 5 hours, something I only ever did on double shifts, not realizing that would be the one day it mattered most. 6 missed calls sat frozen on the screen, all from a dead battery that had given up trying an hour before I'd even clocked out. I didn't answer her right away. I walked past her, up the steps, and tried the door myself. The lock turned, but nothing happened. New hardware, fresh brass, still shining under the porch light like it hadn't even been given the chance to rust. I knocked. Once. The porch light flickered, and then the door opened. My mother stood there in a cream-colored sweater, a glass of red wine in her hand, dry and warm and comfortable, while my daughter shivered behind me in a soaked hoodie. Behind her, in the hallway, my sister Kendra leaned against the wall, scrolling through her phone like this was any other Tuesday night. Inside, past both of them, I could see Kendra's 2 kids sprawled across the couch, feet up on pillows that used to belong to my father's reading chair. On the coffee table, folded with strange, deliberate care, sat Josephine's quilt. The one my father had kept draped over his legs during his last year, the one Josephine had sewn small, crooked stars onto herself while he told her they were the best stars he'd ever seen. Now it sat there like a stranger's forgotten sweater. Past the living room, through the open door of the garage, I could see black garbage bags lined up against the wall, my work uniforms and Josephine's school clothes stuffed inside them, already zip-tied shut like the decision had been made hours before I ever pulled into the driveway. "You changed the locks," I said. My mother took a slow sip of her wine before answering, like my question was beneath urgency. "It was time for a fresh start. She sat out here for 4 hours, Mom. In the rain. She's fine. Children are resilient." I felt Josephine's hand slide into mine. Her fingers were like ice. Then my mother lifted her chin, the same way she used to when she announced dinner was ready, and said the words that would replay in my head for the rest of my life. "We voted. This isn't your home anymore." I looked past her shoulder at Kendra. "We." Kendra didn't even glance up from her phone. "Mom and me," she said. "It's better this way, honestly. Less tension in the house. Less tension." That was the phrase they used for a child sitting outside in the cold for 4 hours because 2 grown women wanted the place to themselves. I felt every unspoken thing from the last 2 years rise up in my throat at once. Every holiday Kendra ruined and I got blamed for. Every night I spent managing my father's medication schedule while she posted vacation photos. Every time I told Josephine everything would be fine when I wasn't sure it would be. But my daughter was standing right there, watching to see what a woman does when someone tries to erase her. So I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I didn't mention the folder that attorney Walter Finch had handed me 6 days earlier, sitting untouched in the bottom drawer of my dresser because I hadn't been ready to open it fully. I only said, "Understood." My mother blinked, thrown off by how calm I sounded. Kendra's smug little smile flickered, just for a second, like she'd been expecting a performance and gotten nothing instead. I turned around, wrapped my arm around my daughter's shoulders, and walked her back to the car without another word. In the rearview mirror, the porch light shrank smaller and smaller until the house disappeared into the dark behind us. To understand how we got to that porch, you have to go back 2 years, to the last spring my father was alive. His name was Richard, and he was a man who spent 40 years as a family doctor, the kind who still made house calls long after other physicians had stopped bothering. He was proud, stubborn, and terrible at accepting help, which made the year he spent sick almost unbearable for everyone except Josephine, who never once treated him like he was fragile. She would sit beside him after school with homework she didn't actually need help with, just so she'd have a reason to be near him. He'd pretend to check her math while secretly falling asleep mid-sentence, and she'd let him, tucking a blanket over his knees without waking him. On weekends, she'd read to him from whatever library book she'd picked that week, doing different voices for each character, and he'd laugh in that low, tired way that always turned into a cough by the end. I worked 12-hour shifts at the hospital as a nurse, came home, made dinner, and handled his medications because I trusted no one else to get the dosages right. I kept a small notebook by his bed, tracking every dose, every reaction, every small change in his breathing, because I'd seen too many families lose track of the details that mattered most. My mother handled almost nothing during that year. She'd sit with him for an hour in the evenings, hand him his tea, and consider her part done. Kendra visited on weekends when it was convenient, always arriving with her children in tow and leaving before bedtime, before the parts of caregiving that were actually hard. I don't say this to paint myself as a martyr. I did it because he was my father, and because some things you do simply because love requires it of you, not because anyone is keeping score. But my mother kept score in her own way, and somehow, in her version of events, my presence in that house became something to resent rather than something to appreciate. When my father passed, the house didn't just lose him. It lost its rhythm, and my mother lost whatever thin patience she'd had left for pretending things between us were fine. Within 2 months, my mother had converted his study into a playroom for Kendra's children. New furniture arrived. New curtains went up. Every photograph of my father disappeared from the walls except one, buried in a hallway corner where no one would notice it unless they were looking. His reading chair, the one Josephine used to curl into beside him, ended up in the garage under a plastic sheet, replaced by a bright plastic playhouse that hummed with batteries no one ever bothered to replace. Kendra and her husband were given a spare key within weeks. Her children were given their own drawers in the hallway closet, their names labeled on masking tape in my mother's careful handwriting. Josephine and I were moved into the smallest bedroom at the end of the hall, the one that used to be a linen closet before it was converted years ago, as though grief came with a shrinking effect that applied only to us. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself grief made people behave strangely, and that eventually things would settle back into something resembling fairness. I made excuses for months. I told Josephine that Grandma just needed time, that things would go back to normal soon, even as the evidence around us suggested otherwise with every passing week. Small things kept happening. My mother would forget to save Josephine a plate at dinner if she ran late from an after-school activity. Kendra's kids got to pick the television shows every single night, while Josephine sat on the floor with a book, never once asking for a turn because she'd learned, somehow, that asking wasn't worth the disappointment. Once, I found Josephine's school art project, a papier-mâché model she'd spent 2 weeks building, sitting in the recycling bin because it was taking up counter space. She never mentioned it to me. I found out from her teacher, who asked why Josephine seemed so withdrawn during the follow-up presentation. I brought it up with my mother once, carefully, trying not to sound accusatory. She waved her hand like I was being dramatic. "You're too sensitive about that girl," she said. "She needs to learn the world doesn't revolve around her." I remember standing in the kitchen after that conversation, gripping the edge of the counter, trying to decide whether staying silent was patience or cowardice. I didn't have an answer yet. I just knew that leaving would mean uprooting Josephine from the only home she had left that still smelled like her grandfather's old books, and some misguided part of me thought that mattered more than it should have. Then, 6 days before that rainy night on the porch, I received a call from Walter Finch, my father's longtime attorney. He asked me to come to his office. I assumed it was routine, some insurance paperwork or a final tax form that needed a signature, the kind of loose end that always trails behind a death for longer than anyone expects. Instead, he handed me a thick folder, looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place, somewhere between caution and relief, and told me that my father had made certain arrangements in his final year of clarity, arrangements he had asked to remain sealed until, in Walter's words, the right moment presented itself, and you'll know it when it does. I took the folder home. I didn't open it. Some stubborn, hopeful part of me still wanted one honest conversation with my family before I needed whatever was inside that folder to defend myself. I told myself I'd open it once things had calmed down, once I found the right moment to sit my mother down and talk, adult to adult, about how unbalanced everything had become. 6 days later, Josephine's key stopped working, and that hope evaporated somewhere between the porch steps and my mother's wineglass. The apartment where Josephine and I spent that first night belonged to my coworker Priscilla, a fellow nurse who didn't ask a single question when I showed up at 11 at night with a soaked, shivering child and 2 overnight bags. She handed us towels, made hot chocolate, and set up the pull-out couch without a word of judgment. She just looked at Josephine's face, then at mine and said, "Stay as long as you need," before slipping into her own room to give us space. Josephine fell asleep with her backpack still clutched against her chest, like she needed to know at least one thing in the world couldn't be taken from her overnight. I sat on the floor beside the couch until sunrise, staring at the ceiling, running through every version of the conversation I hadn't had the strength to have that night. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, Josephine stirred and murmured something in her sleep. I leaned closer and caught only a fragment of it. "Key doesn't fit," she whispered, still dreaming. I stayed there until her breathing steadied again. I called in sick to my shift the next morning, something I almost never did, and sat at Priscilla's kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me while Josephine watched cartoons on mute in the next room, too unsettled to focus on the sound. In the morning, I called Walter Finch. I told him everything. The locks, the porch, the 4 hours, the quilt folded up like garbage on the coffee table. I told him what my mother said, word for word, because I knew I would never forget it. I told him about the recycling bin, about the drawers labeled in masking tape, about the reading chair buried under a plastic sheet in the garage, because suddenly all of it felt connected in a way I hadn't let myself see before. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Whitney," he said finally, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it, "I need you to bring the folder in today. All of it. And don't discuss any of this with your mother or your sister before we talk. Not one word." I didn't ask why. Something in his tone told me not to. That afternoon, I dropped Josephine off with Priscilla, who offered without hesitation to pick her up from school, and drove to Walter's office with the folder sitting on the passenger seat like it weighed more than it should have. Sitting across from him in his office, surrounded by shelves of legal binders and the steady hum of a window air conditioner, I finally opened the folder my father had left behind. Inside were documents I hadn't expected. A revised living trust, dated 14 months before his passing, back when he was still sharp enough to understand exactly what he was signing, along with a certified letter from his physician confirming his mental competency on that exact date, as if my father had known even then that someone might someday try to argue otherwise. There was a handwritten letter addressed to me, 3 pages long, folded into thirds, and a separate, sealed envelope marked, in his familiar doctor's scrawl, for my mother. Walter explained it slowly, giving me time to absorb each sentence. My father, worried even, then about how the family might behave after he was gone, had carefully restructured the ownership of the house. It hadn't been left outright to my mother, as everyone assumed. It had been placed into a trust, with specific, binding conditions attached, conditions designed to protect exactly the two people who had spent the most time caring for him in his final years. Me and Josephine. The house could not be sold, altered, or used to exclude either of us, not without violating the terms of a legally binding document. My mother retained the right to live there and make reasonable decisions about the household, but the trust specifically prohibited any action that removed, excluded, or materially harmed either of us. If those terms were violated, the trust required Walter, as the appointed trustee, to formally enforce Richard's instructions and initiate the transfer clause, which would move ownership to me and Josephine and require my mother to vacate within 30 days of formal notice. "I want to be clear about how this works," Walter said, folding his hands on the desk. "I'm not able to act on suspicion or a phone call. As trustee, I need documented evidence of a violation before I can enforce this clause. What you described tonight, the locks, the timeline, the belongings, that's enough for me to move forward. But once I deliver that notice, the process becomes formal and binding. There's no undoing it once it's served." My mother had violated the trust's terms the moment she changed the locks and left an 11-year-old outside in the rain. And once Walter formally served the notice, that violation would become impossible to argue away. I opened the handwritten letter with shaking hands. My father's handwriting had grown shakier in his final months, but every word was still deliberate, still exactly like him. He wrote about watching me manage his care that year, about noticing things he suspected I hadn't noticed about myself, how easily I absorbed unfairness without complaint, how quickly I made myself smaller so other people could feel bigger. He wrote that he hoped this document would never need to be used. But he also wrote that he'd watched my mother and Kendra treat me as an afterthought for years, and that he refused to let that pattern outlive him unprotected. "I know you'll try to give them every chance before you use this," he'd written near the end. "That's exactly who you are, and exactly why I trust you with it. Just promise me you won't wait so long that Josephine pays the price for your patience." I sat in that office and felt something shift inside my chest. Not triumph exactly, but a steady kind of clarity. My father, even in his final year, even while his body was failing him, had seen clearly enough to protect us from something the rest of the family couldn't yet admit they were capable of. "There's one more thing," Walter said, sliding a final page across the desk, his expression softer than it had been all afternoon. He asked that if this clause was ever triggered, I deliver the notice in person. He was very specific about that. He said your mother would need to hear it from someone she couldn't argue her way around. He paused, folding his hands. "For what it's worth, Whitney, I hoped I would never have to deliver these papers." Richard hoped the same thing, but he made sure I'd be ready if it came to this. I looked down at the page. A formal notice of trust violation, along with a 30-day vacate order, addressed to my mother, ready to be delivered. I thought about the porch, the quilt on the coffee table, the word, understood, I'd forced myself to say instead of everything else boiling underneath it. I thought about how easily my mother had said we voted, as though fairness had ever been up for a vote in that house. "When can you deliver it?" I asked. "Whenever you're ready. There's no rush on my end, but I'd advise against waiting too long. The longer the violation sits unaddressed, the more complicated it can get if she tries to argue you accepted the new arrangement." I looked at Josephine's drawing taped to the inside of my bag, a crooked little house with 3 stick figures standing in front of it, drawn back before any of this began, back when she still believed that house was simply home and nothing more complicated than that. 3 days, I said. "Give me 3 days to get her settled first." Those 3 days were some of the strangest of my life. I went back to work. I dropped Josephine off at school. I signed her up for a new after-school program closer to Priscilla's apartment, just in case. I did not call my mother. I did not call Kendra. I let the stillness stretch, the same stillness my mother had mistaken for surrender on that porch. On the second day, my mother texted me for the first time since that night. "Are you being dramatic on purpose? Come get your things properly instead of hiding." I stared at the message for a long time before locking my phone screen without responding. There was no version of that conversation that would have gone anywhere good, and I needed my energy for something that actually mattered. On the second night, I finally sat Josephine down and explained, in terms an 11-year-old could hold on to without being frightened by them, that Grandpa had left some instructions a long time ago to make sure we'd always have a safe place to live, and that those instructions were about to matter very soon. She listened carefully, the way she always did, and then asked only one question. "Is Grandma going to be mad at you?" "Probably," I told her honestly. "But being mad doesn't mean she's right." She nodded slowly, like she was filing that sentence away somewhere important, and went back to drawing at the kitchen table like the conversation hadn't shifted something between us. On the third day, I drove back to the house with Walter Finch beside me, a single sealed envelope resting on his lap. The rain had stopped by then, but the porch boards still held a dull, damp shine from days before. It felt strange walking up those same steps sober and steady, without a soaked child clutching my hand, without 4 hours of cold behind me. Walter knocked. My mother opened the door in the same cream sweater, the same posture of cool superiority, clearly expecting to see me standing there alone, ready for another round of pleading. Instead, she saw a stranger in a gray suit holding an envelope with the law firm's letterhead printed across the corner. Kendra appeared behind her almost immediately, phone already raised, filming, the way she always did whenever she sensed something she could later use against me. She had no idea she was about to record her own undoing. "Marilyn," Walter said evenly, "I have a legal notice for you regarding the property trust established by Richard." My mother's expression flickered, confusion first, then irritation. "A notice about what?" "Richard's been gone 2 years. Whatever paperwork needed handling was handled a long time ago." "Not all of it," Walter said. "I'd recommend you read this before saying anything further." She took the envelope like it was an inconvenience, tore it open carelessly, and began to read. I watched her lips move slightly as she scanned the first paragraph, the way people do when they're trying to convince themselves the words in front of them don't mean what they clearly mean. I watched her face change in real time. The irritation melted into disbelief. The disbelief hardened into something pale and stunned. Her hand, still holding the edge of the wine glass she'd carried to the door out of habit, began to tremble slightly, enough that a few drops of wine slipped over the rim and landed on the porch boards, dark red against the gray wood. "This isn't real," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This can't be real. He wouldn't have done this without telling me." "It's very real," Walter said, his voice calm but firm, the voice of a man who had delivered difficult news more times than he could count. "Richard set up the trust 14 months before he passed. Every clause is enforceable, and every signature was properly witnessed and notarized, including a competency letter from his physician dated the same day. The locks, the exclusion of a minor beneficiary, the removal of her belongings from the premises, all of it constitutes a documented, time-stamped violation of the trust's core protective clause. Under the trust, I am required as trustee to enforce Richard's instructions. This notice formally triggers the transfer clause effective today." Kendra lowered her phone slowly, her recording forgotten, her expression shifting from smug curiosity to something closer to alarm. "Wait, what does that mean? What is she talking about, Mom?" "It means," Walter said, turning slightly to include her in the explanation, "that as of this notice, ownership of the property begins transferring to Whitney and her daughter, per the terms Richard specified. The paperwork finalizing the transfer will process over the next several days, but the 30-day vacate clock starts today, and it isn't something a family vote can undo." The stillness that followed was unlike anything I had ever stood inside. My mother looked at me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, she looked genuinely afraid, not of losing an argument, but of losing something she had assumed could never be taken. "You planned this," she said, her voice rising, cracking slightly at the edges. "This whole time you knew. You've been sitting on this, waiting to humiliate me." "No," I said evenly. "Dad planned this. I just waited until I didn't have a choice anymore. I gave you 3 days after that night to reach out, to apologize, to say one honest thing. You texted me to come get my things properly. That was your chance, Mom." Kendra's mouth opened and closed, searching for words that never came. This is insane. You can't just take a house because of one bad night. It wasn't one bad night, I said, and for the first time since the porch, I let a little more of what I'd been holding show in my voice. It was 2 years of being treated like an inconvenience, and then it was my daughter sitting outside for 4 hours in the rain because neither of you thought that mattered enough to stop what you were doing. Dad thought it would matter. That's the only reason this document exists. Her children's laughter drifted faintly from inside the house, unaware that the ground beneath them had just shifted permanently. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stood there and let the weight of the document speak for itself, the same way I had let one word speak for itself on that porch 3 days earlier. Understood, I said again, this time watching my mother absorb the full meaning of the word she had once dismissed so easily. The 30 days that followed were calmer than our family had ever been before. My mother tried calling twice, both times attempting a version of an apology that centered more on her own embarrassment than on the hours Josephine had spent shivering on that porch. The first voicemail was mostly about how humiliating it had been to have Walter show up, like some kind of process server, in front of the neighbors. The second was shorter and colder, informing me that her attorney would be reviewing the trust for any possible loopholes. I let both calls go to voicemail. Some conversations aren't owed immediately, especially not to people who only reach for kindness after consequences arrive. Kendra sent one message, short and defensive, insisting she'd just gone along with it and hadn't meant for things to go that far, followed a day later by a much longer message accusing me of tearing the family apart over one misunderstanding. I didn't respond to either. Not answering, I was learning, could be its own complete sentence, and I no longer felt obligated to fill it just to keep other people comfortable. Walter checked in once during that stretch, letting me know that my mother's attorney had, in fact, reviewed the trust and found nothing to challenge. Richard had been thorough. Every date, every signature, every clause had been built to withstand exactly this kind of scrutiny, as though he'd known, even at his most exhausted, that someone would eventually try to pick it apart. On the 30th day, I stood in the driveway of the house again, this time with a moving truck instead of a soaked child beside me. My mother and Kendra's family had already gone, relocated to a rental across town, taking with them the furniture that was legally theirs and leaving behind the rest, including, I noticed, the bright plastic playhouse still sitting in the corner of what used to be my father's study, unplugged and silent. Josephine walked up the porch steps first this time, pulled her key from her pocket, and pushed it into the lock without hesitation. It turned smoothly, the same way it should have turned that rainy night months earlier, and the door opened under her own hand. She stood there for a second, just looking at it, like she needed to confirm it was real before stepping through. She stopped in the hallway, staring at the empty space where her grandfather's photo had once been buried in a corner, and without a word, she opened her backpack and pulled out a small framed picture she'd kept safe the entire time, one she must have rescued from a box weeks earlier without telling me. She walked to that same spot and set it gently back where it belonged, adjusting it twice until it sat perfectly straight. "There," she said softly. "Now it looks right again." I stood behind her in the hallway and let myself feel, for the first time in weeks, like the ground under our feet was actually solid. I stood behind her, watching her small hands straighten the frame with the same careful attention she'd once used stitching stars onto a quilt for a man who never stopped believing in her, even while he was fading. Later that evening, after the boxes were mostly unpacked and the quilt was back on Josephine's bed where it belonged, she looked up at me from the couch and asked the question I'd been waiting for since that night on the porch. "Do you think Grandma will ever say sorry? Like, really mean it?" I thought about it honestly before answering, because she deserved honesty more than comfort. "Maybe someday," I said, "but you don't have to wait around for it to feel okay again. You already are okay." That was never something she got to decide. She nodded slowly, pulling the quilt a little tighter around her shoulders, and for the first time in weeks, I watched her fall asleep without clutching her backpack like a shield. I sat beside her for a long while after that, listening to the steady hum of a house that finally felt like ours in every sense that mattered, not just on paper, but in the way the air settled, the way the porch light stayed on without needing permission from anyone. Some people believe love means tolerating anything, staying silent, keeping the peace even when the peace was never fair to begin with. I used to believe that too, until I watched my daughter shiver on a porch because two grown women decided her comfort was optional. My father spent his final year making sure that decision would eventually cost them everything they thought they controlled. And I spent 3 careful days making sure his intentions actually reached the people who needed to hear them. We didn't raise our voices. We didn't need to. Sometimes the loudest answer to cruelty is a single word, delivered calmly, while the real answer is already on its way in a sealed envelope. Josephine still keeps her key on a small keychain shaped like a star, one she picked out herself the week we moved back in. She doesn't grip it the way she used to, white-knuckled, like it might stop working at any moment. Some evenings, she sits in her grandfather's old reading chair, the one I pulled out of the garage and had reupholstered with that same quilt draped over her knees, and I catch myself thinking that maybe this is what he actually wanted all along. Not revenge, just a home that couldn't be taken away from the people who never stopped showing up for it. If you were in my place that night on the porch, would you have said understood and waited, or would you have said something else entirely? Tell me what you would have done, right in the comments below.